So first of all, thank you very much for joining today. This is a bit of an inaugural for those of you who are watching on what was formerly called LinkedIn Live, which is now called Office Hours, starting today. And speaking of office hours, I am in a bit of a different location. I am not in my office, but I'm actually in my home. And so you get a chance to take a peek and see what my home looks like. And I just look at my picture and I look like Mitch McConnell with earbuds. So I don't know how flattering that is. But in any case, let's go ahead and just perhaps to get everybody up to speed, feel free to go ahead and add any type of chat comments to the chat box, what you consider done to be. And then we'll go ahead and review that together. But without going on and on and on, let me go ahead and get started with a quote that I found. And of course, I suspect that a number of you are familiar with Simon Sinek. And he states, leaders must transition from being responsible for the job to being responsible for the people who are responsible for the job. And I really like that quote, and I wanted to go ahead and share it with you because I think that has everything to do with the subject when we're talking about being done. And if I'm the person who's responsible, then I need to make sure that I pass on the message to all of the individuals working on the project so they understand what my expectations are. Okay, and there are different flavors of done. And let me give you some examples. Let me go ahead and make sure I get the right slide here going. Different flavors of done. I've worked on too many projects to count where the customer had a different idea of what done was, what we thought was done, and certainly not for that price were we considering that to be done. I've been on a number of projects when we didn't want to be done, not necessarily me as the project manager or me as being part of a project team, but the executive sponsor didn't want the project to be done. And I'm thinking that might sound a little bit funny. Why wouldn't somebody want this project to be finished? Because they did not trust operations. Once we would hand the project over to operations, that operations would be able to manage it properly. And I think in certain cases, we don't feel that we got enough requirements, and so we're really afraid to go into prime time. That would be another example. Perhaps you might be able to think of some cases from your past projects that you've worked on where there was a differentiation between how we actually went ahead and considered what done was. That would be very interesting to go ahead and share that with the group. So I'm going to go ahead and explain to you something that's going to sound a little bit funny. There was a commercial in the United States in the 1970s, and I won't name the actual product per se, but within this commercial, there was somebody who actually had a lot to eat. And so the punchline of the commercial was, I can't believe I ate the whole thing. And I thought that was actually quite appropriate for this story because very often we think that bigger scopes are better. And in essence, defining what done is and looking at it from a scope perspective is actually a very interesting approach because the larger the scope, the more difficult it might be to actually be done. And so the problem is always that our eyes are too big. Our eyes are too big for our stomach very often, going back to the example. But our eyes are too big for defining what we actually want to do. And very often we think that we can do it, but then we are in the middle and we realize that actually we can't. So let's go ahead and look at this from an organizational perspective. And I think you know what it's like, or I suspect a number of you will know what it's like when you're working in a company, and this is to be a depiction of an org chart, and you see the different boxes. And within this org chart, the people that are working within those various teams are going to define what done is in a different way. And I can speak from my personal experience that I've run across this way too often, that we all have a different definition of done. And you know what happens? The customer is going to also have a different definition of done, and it's not going to match any of those that you found within those boxes. And that leads to dissatisfaction. And so the real question is not only how we go ahead and look at done, but who are we doing the work for, and to what degree do they consider it to be done? I'll go one step further, and we'll have a customer who will be asking for more than what you can actually do. And sometimes we're not really in the position to go ahead and tell them that we're not able to deliver. And so we've already looked at about this question of done. So if we agree that if we're not ready, we cannot be done, so what's the real problem? The problem are impediments. And for those of you who have perhaps not heard of this word before, impediments, these are these things that get in the way that stop you from getting to done. So let's go ahead and I'll give you an example of something a little bit more concrete. You are driving in your car and you're on the road, and all of a sudden there is a traffic jam. And that happens often enough. And so you cannot get to your destination because you have this traffic jam. So what is the impediment? Well, the traffic jam is the impediment. And so either you will try to go around the traffic jam, go on to a different road, or sometimes you don't have an option and you'll just have to go ahead and sit it out. So for all effects and purposes, that is an example of what an impediment is. So let's go ahead and take a look at different types of impediments. And I've gone ahead and put together different concepts. And let's go ahead and start with some of the more predominant ones that I have run across in projects. And please feel free to go ahead and put some examples that you could think of within the chat box and share that with a group. I think that would be quite good. So lack of knowledge is one that I have run across quite often, not necessarily my knowledge, although that has happened certainly often enough. But we've been asked as a team to go ahead and come up with some deliverables that we've never done before. So that means that there is a learning curve. We need to have a better idea of what this is all about before we can go ahead and put it together. So, and very possibly the lack of knowledge is not solely refined to the deliverables per se, but maybe you're working in a different area. A very common impediment that I've run across tied to knowledge is working in a new sector, one that you've never worked in before, or perhaps working with a new group and you've never worked with them before, and understanding how they work. Very often I've been on projects, and of course, every company has their own way of communicating, and especially they all work with acronyms, and they assume that everybody understands their acronyms, and you spend like at least the first half of the day, perhaps the first whole day, and trying to figure out what are these acronyms that they're talking about. So these are all examples of perhaps a lack of knowledge and just trying to get up to speed. The middle one, I think, is the one that we know the most, or at least in the projects that I've worked on, I've known it the most, and that would be a lack of personnel. We don't have enough personnel. And here I'd like to go ahead and describe something very typical from the projects that I've worked on, where we've actually gone ahead and put through the assignment. Let's say, for example, for academic purposes, I am the project manager. And what is the first thing you do as a project manager, even if you don't even understand what the project's about? You look for people who are going to work on your team, because they seem to be the most difficult element to go ahead and put together, because nobody wants to give up their personnel. So that's the one that I've always run across. One of the biggest impediments is very much tied to not having personnel. Lack of capacity is another one. Let me give you an example of what I'm referring to here. Lack of capacity. We're in production, and for this project, we need to produce something new. And very possibly, it will require some space, new storage space, or maybe different type of storage space. And we are not capable of actually going ahead and putting through the deliverables because we just don't have the capacity within our complex. So that would be another typical type of impediment. So let's go ahead and move on to some more. Here are some that I suspect some of you are familiar with. Lack of capital. We do not have enough money to run the project. Now, again, I don't know if you've run across this situation. Be very keen. Please feel free to go ahead and share this in the chat box. But I've been in enough projects where in the middle of the project, we decided that we did not have enough money to go ahead and continue the project. And of course, that meant that we either would put things on hold or we would kill the project. But that one's a very serious impediment. I think for the most part, if I think honestly about the projects, I think if it was important enough, they would have come up with the money, but obviously it wasn't. So they didn't. And that's how we went ahead and continued. The next one, I think that some of you, who needs money when you have workers, right? Because the workers don't work. They work, but they're free. Oh yes, Andrew, thank you very much for that comment, because this is one that I always thought was very, very interesting, where we think, oh, but we don't have to worry about money. We have workers, and we tend to forget that the workers are getting paid, and so we cannot consider that to be free. Furthermore, workers or any personnel in a project, for me, are incremental costs, meaning that you could always go ahead and turn that off. You might not necessarily be in a position to relieve yourself of the personnel, but they are incremental costs, right? And workers are money, human capital. Thank you very much, Sophia. Yes, full agreement. So let's go back to the slide so I don't totally lose track here. Lack of support and cooperation. If you think about that org chart that I showed you earlier, that's a typical one where each team consider themselves to be completely sovereign. In other words, they don't need anybody else. They don't want to deal with anyone else. And the last thing they want to do is help you if you run across problems within your project. Or conversely, you might have the heads of these departments that actually have nothing to do with your project, but they just want to cause trouble. And I'm afraid I've run across that one quite a bit as well. These are true impediments. And then another one that I think we don't talk about very often, but this is another one that I've run across very, very often within my career. Lack of maturity. We were not ready for this project. And when I say not ready for this project, let me explain this to you a little bit more in detail. Did we have the knowledge? The answer is yes. Did we have the personnel? Let's say, yes, we had the personnel as well. But we were not able, from a company perspective, a company maturity perspective, to actually go ahead and roll this project, the deliverables for this project out. And so that's something that we should have thought of in advance, but we didn't. And I think it goes back to that example I gave you earlier, those project, the executive sponsors that do not want to end projects because they're so afraid to hand it over to operations. That would be a very typical example. So let's move on. I have a few more examples for you here. Another impediment, of course, that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and perhaps maybe most of you, is poor communication. As we know within project management, that we might have a discussion on the subject, but I would say at least 80% of a project manager's job is to concentrate on communication. And so if the communication is poor, then obviously that's an impediment. And I'm not necessarily always referring to the project manager who is conducting the poor communication. Could be coming from upper management, or it could be coming from the clients. The clients don't communicate very well. I've been in a number of projects where the clients try to drag you into their own politics, which is something that we should definitely avoid. And part of the problem was very often aligned to different types of communication, and maybe we're not always sure of what we need to do. Poor organization, of course, we know if we're not organized properly, then obviously that's going to be an impediment for getting done. And I consider these to be separate: poor organization and poor teamwork, because you could be well organized, but you still don't have a team. So that is also an impediment. So here's another quote that I'd like to go ahead and share with you. This is another one coming from Simon Sinek. The role of a leader is not to come up with all the great ideas. The role of a leader is to create an environment in which great ideas can happen. And I would argue that has everything to do with our subject matter. It might sound funny, that my claim here, but if we are not ready to go ahead and deploy our ideas in a proper fashion, then we are not ready. And that means we will never get to done. So let's go ahead and continue. So the idea is, are we ready to go ahead and sprint to getting to done? Now, all of this is what I'm talking about doesn't necessarily always have to refer to the type of project we have. In other words, the style of the project per se. But here I have to make a bit of a confession to all of you. I consider myself to be an agilist, meaning that I try not to do what I can't do. I try to take small pieces, knowing full well that there's a lot that I don't know. And if I start trying to deploy something that I really don't know, the chances of something going wrong are actually pretty high. So I prefer small bite-sized chunks that we can go ahead and try out. So if things don't really work out the way that you want, well, we didn't really put much of an effort into it. Or, well, sorry, I disagree with that. I make a correction, hit the stop button. We do make an effort, but if indeed we didn't get the results that we were looking for, it wasn't a problem. And furthermore, we need to be able to experiment to learn. And I personally believe that following an agile approach, or let's call it an agile approach, or probably be easiest, is the more efficient way of actually going ahead and moving forward. So here are some of the points that I've run across over the years where we have difficulties in defining not only done, but also defining ready. Because of course, if we don't know if we're ready or not, or if we think we're ready and we're not, well, we're never going to get to done. Estimations is one of the big impediments that I have come across. So let me give you some examples of some of the problems that I've run across and tied to estimations. So let's say we are a team, all of us, everybody who's watching this live stream right now, we are a team, and we have a project that needs to be completed. And that means that we're all going to have a different idea of how much work that actually is and how long it will take for us to actually get this completed or get to done. And this is inevitably one of the biggest problems that we run across within projects. I live in Vienna, Austria, but I'm not originally from Vienna. I'm originally from the United States. And that makes it for very interesting situations every once in a while. But I've noticed that there are some cultural elements when we come to this estimation part. There's one example I'd like to go ahead and share. When we, maybe something else I should go ahead and mention, I worked in the IT field for a number of years. And so a lot of times I was dealing with some sort of software creation. So we'll go ahead and have the team together and we will ask, so how long will it take to actually complete that work or get to done? And I've noticed that there's a big cultural element And please, I hope I'm not offending anybody. I'm speaking more about myself and getting back to the example that I gave, it's too big to eat. Well, there have been times, I confess to all of you, there have been times where I have tried to bite off more than I could actually chew because we think that we can make it happen. Somehow there will be the light that comes from the sky that will actually help us in making this happen. So we'll say, yeah, but we can get it done. We'll just work overtime. And of course, that was always the mentality. Not very healthy, but I admit I'm a sinner. I went ahead and performed that. And then there were other people I've noticed in certain countries here in Europe that will always tell you that they can only get this much done. And you're thinking the whole time, surely they can get this much, they can get much more than this part done. And so I wondered, why is that such a problem? Why do people go ahead and just come up with mini estimations where I know that they can do much more? And then I came to the conclusion, and perhaps you might be familiar with this one as well, but they were so afraid that they would never get to done, and they would be held accountable because they never got to done. They never ever wanted to put themselves in that situation. And let's be honest, there's always a little bit of risk in understanding what the assignment is and defining how we can actually get to done. Furthermore, there are impediments. There are problems that appear on the project that you cannot do anything about. And so it makes no sense in holding everybody accountable for something they should not be held accountable for. So for me, that was a little bit of a struggle to get my head around that, but that's one that I've run across more often than not. So making estimations seems to be a real issue because some people are really afraid of not getting to done, and so they make done a mini done, and with that, nobody's really happy on that one either. So let's go ahead and move to my next example. Saying no. Now, again, I'm going to make some assumptions that some of you are familiar with the situation. Inevitably, we work in companies and everybody has their role, and very often the ones that are going ahead and selling whatever the services are not the ones who are actually deploying. So they're never really held accountable for that of what they promised. You in turn are confronted with this, and you need to figure out some way to actually go ahead and make it happen. And I've come to the conclusion that I'm much better off in being honest with all the parties concerned, including the customer, not putting anybody on the spot. We should never do that because that's clearly not professional. But if we cannot meet the expectations, then we need to have a serious conversation. Oh, I'm going to tell you about a project that I ran across. Oh, this was about 20 years ago. It was a software development project. And I was told what the solution was. Wasn't quite well, actually, it was clear what the problem was, and then I had an opportunity to meet with the customer and also with the employees who would be part of this project, and they were colleagues of mine, and the colleagues were very, very hostile. Maybe hostile is a strong word, but they were very reserved. Let's put it this way. They were very reserved, and it took a long time for me to go ahead and strike up a conversation and really find out what that issue was. And they were not happy about the project. They were afraid that we were trying to put something together that really wasn't needed. And I had to admit, at that point in time, I was not ready to go ahead and say no. The project was actually coming from my boss. So you think twice before you actually go ahead and say, well, actually, maybe we should be working on something else. But I finally caught up the courage to go ahead and say, actually, this is what everybody wants. So I got everybody together and I said, so this is what I have heard. This is what the project is. This is what I've heard so far. And am I right? Is this really what you're looking for? And they all said yes. And of course, it was much cheaper, much easier to go ahead and deploy. And then I had to figure out the way to go back to my boss and said, actually, everybody wants something completely different. Luckily, the boss was pretty cool. and I was able to make it happen. But part of it was saying, no, we don't continue on this path. We need to go ahead and take things up in a different way. So let me go ahead and continue. And there's another point that I'd like to raise, and this is another cultural element that I've run across quite often. The group versus the individual. There are, and this could also be on the level of a company, that the company prizes superstars. And so that means that everybody's going ahead and working as an individual, trying to make sure that he or she shines, and group work is completely thrown out the window. Then you have the other example where everything is focusing on the group, and if you have a different opinion than the group, then that is a serious problem. So the real question is, how do we go ahead and come up with a balance between these different concepts, looking at it from a group perspective or from an individual perspective? And I think part of it is tied to having a better appreciation of who's on your team, where they're coming from, why they're reacting the way they do, because it could be quite different than the way you go ahead and react. And I think a little bit of empathy can go a very, very long way. So here are some general thoughts from my end that I'd like to go ahead and share with you, especially if we're looking at this idea of done and efficiency. For the most part, we are in an environment where we think that standardization is always the best solution. And please don't take this wrong. I think that standardization is required. Sometimes it's the only way that you can make things scalable. And certainly when putting such an emphasis on to efficiency, then standardization is extremely important. But then I ask you the question, if we look at this from a project management perspective, if we're very efficient, but we're not very effective, in other words, we're able to get things out the door, but nobody can use it, is that really in our interest? So the real question is going to be, how do we go ahead and define when we need to be a little bit more flexible, and understanding that maybe the solution doesn't necessarily fit into the standardized approach, or if we're not really quite sure of what they're looking for, that maybe we take the time and put the standard process on hold, take a step back, and have a better understanding of what the requirements are. And so I've come to the conclusion that we actually need both. We need to have standardization so that we have a basis by which we make sure that things are getting completed, and there's a certain quality, because standardization means you have the same quality regardless of who's working on the projects. On the same token, if we're coming up with products that nobody is really finding of value, then we need to be able to go ahead and take a step back and looking at the situation from a different perspective. So the natural progression for me was coming up with yin yang, coming up with that balance between standard and flexibility. Here's another tip that I think is very, very important. If we're trying to come up with teams that feel that they are able to work autonomously, that means they're working on their own and they have a sense of mastery, they have the feeling that they're getting better all the time. And that really helps building a team. But what happens when you have different teams going ahead and performing different exercises? The idea is, how do we go ahead and make sure that we are allowing everybody to work at their own way, but we have the overall goal in mind. So the real challenge here is keeping a balance between autonomy on the one side and performing some sort of alignment with all the other individuals who are responsible in your project. Now, this doesn't mean it's an easy exercise. In fact, it's very, very difficult, and sometimes it's time consuming. But the fact is, if we're looking to come up with a mature organization where you have people that feel empowered and we're able to go ahead and come and develop a sense of diversity, that people are coming from different directions and we value their opinion, then that means that by nature, we are going to run across some sort of conflict because everybody's going to have a different opinion. Let's go ahead and close this circle. Our subject is talking about done. What is done? Now, is it possible that you have different groups that have different opinions of what done is? Of course it is. So the real question is, how do you go ahead and bring the teams together and make sure that you come up with a common understanding? The fact is, if you're able to do that, not only can you come up with autonomous teams that are high producing, you don't have to worry about people going a different direction. And in fact, the alignment is the element that keeps you in the standardization. And here's another tip from my side. Of course, I suspect that most of you have probably run across this model, or I'm going to assume that most of you have come across this model. It has different names. I'm going to call it the triple constraint. And the idea of this model is that if you change one component, it has effect on the other two. So let me give you an example. If we're going ahead and changing the scope of the project, which would be, of course, our definition of done gets larger, then that has an effect on the cost of your project and the time that's required to actually go ahead and get it done. Now, I'm going to tell you something that I've run across a few times in projects that I thought was a little bit funny. So the scope has changed, but then I hear, but it's not going to cost anymore, and we'll be able to deliver it at the same time. Now, I'm not saying that we cannot manage this in some fashion, but if you get this time and time again, then you have to wonder, how was the estimation when you actually went ahead and put together your project plan? Inquiring minds would like to know. So this idea of the triple constraint, of course, has been one of the biggest struggles that we have in project management. But I'm going to go ahead and turn this one on its head, and I'd be keen on your feedback. So instead of us actually going ahead and saying we call it scope, what if we called it value? Now think about this. Is there a change in the way that we approach our project? I would argue yes, because now we say value to cost and value to time. So if you are getting a pushback from, say, for example, a client who is talking about the scope, then if we talk about the value, then you can go ahead and pose the question, is it worth your while to pay this much for this value? And then either they say, yes, it is in my interest, or they say, no, it's not in my interest. But this is very revealing because, one, let's start with the latter. No, they say it's not worth the cost. Then the question is, if it's not worth the price, then why are we doing it? Or conversely, if you have a problem with a customer who's complaining about the price, if you focus on the benefits, the real value that's being generated by your project, then they understand why they're paying what they're paying. And I think it helps you all the way around. This same approach applies to time. So that would mean, is it worth it for you to have people working on the project to deliver this? And if it's not, then you really have to raise the question, why are we doing it? And then, of course, the flip side also applies. If they see the value, then they won't have problems giving you personnel, which is always, I think that had to have been the biggest issue I've run across as being a project manager, getting the people that will make the project a success. Then it makes it easier for you as a project manager to go ahead and get not only personnel for your project, but to get the right people, because then you can go ahead and make the business case right, because these people are the ones who are going to deliver you value. And then, of course, the recipient is going to have a better idea of what they'll be seeing at the end. For me, all of these last scenarios that I described to you have everything to do with done and ready, because done, of course, is always tied to value in some fashion. If we think that it doesn't really matter what we do, and we just go ahead and cross things off the list, then very often we're probably not concentrating on value. Now, if we all follow that path, then what is the value that we're actually producing? Furthermore, don't even talk about personal satisfaction, which for me personally has to be one of the biggest, the most important things, because if I feel that I'm not bringing value, then I really go ahead and eventually ask myself the question, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this job? So that's very, very important. And then, of course, to understand what your impediments are. And sometimes the impediments are that, just like that commercial, it's too big. I can't believe I ate the whole thing. So these are some of the thoughts that I've had on the subject, and I really wanted to go ahead and share them with you. So let's see if I can come up with some last thoughts, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at the chat box and certainly any questions you might have. So in passing, would we go ahead and say that bigger is better? Or would we go ahead and say that better is better and not concentrate on the size, but on the quality, knowing full well that if we pay less for something, but it has no value, then we paid too much. We clearly paid too much. So let's get past the idea that bigger is better. We concentrate on better is better. One last quote from my side: leaders take all the blame and give away all the credit. And I think that's something that's very important for a project manager. So I'm, in closing, ask you the question, are you ready? And then let's go ahead and see if I can spend some time taking a look at some of the questions you might have posed in the chat box. Please feel free to go ahead and contribute to the chat box. And let me go ahead and start in the beginning. And I make a promise to you, if I missed one of your questions, and that happens, I'm a human being, if I miss one of your questions, then I will go back after our session's finished and I will look through the chat box, because there's a functionality in LinkedIn certainly allows me to go ahead and do that. So if I don't answer it now, please do not despair. I promise to go through the chat box and answer the questions. So let's see. Going through some general comments. Yes, everybody's here. That's great to hear. Agilist. Andrew, you're funny. Okay, so this is coming from Sophia. Can this be something to be archived incrementally? Hence the description, done would also be changed over time. Yes, that's great. Thank you for that question, Sophia, because I usually use the term big scope and little scope. And so what does this actually mean? Little scope is those things that you can do now that need to be completed, but you're not done. You're not done with the whole thing. But it's a collection of a bunch of little scopes that will get you to your big scope. Furthermore, again, I'm just following the practice that we talk about within Agile. If we can get something that brings value to the customer sooner, then that is clearly in our interest. So maybe that little scope or a collection of little scopes is not the final product, but it helps in building up trust with your client. It allows the clients to understand your processes and can actually get benefits sooner. And so that's one way that you can actually go ahead and do that, working with a collection of little scopes, and that's leading to your big scope. And one last closing comment on this idea of little scope and big scope that I think is important. And this is going back to experiences that I've had in projects that we thought that we knew what the scope was. And then, of course, we're in the middle of the project and we realized that the scope was something completely different. Or I can follow up with the example I gave you with regards to one project where I said no to my boss. And it's important to make sure that you are always bringing value. And if the scope that you're working on doesn't really bring the value, then it's time to go ahead and change the scope. And then we need to go ahead and perform an estimation. Is it worth the cost? Is it worth the time? So I hope that answered your question, Sophia. Let's see what Roger is asking. What are some strategies for wrapping up all the last minute detail to be done? Yeah, good question. Let me think about this one. So the last minute detail to get done, is it a case of where we didn't, and this happens, that we thought we knew what was done, what was supposed to be done, but then we ran across some things that we didn't include in done? I would make a differentiation between not clearly defining done. Let's be honest, we're human beings. So I mean, this could definitely take place. Not clearly defining done, or maybe Roger, in the question that you're asking, in fact, I could even go ahead. I forgot that I have this functionality. There we go. That perhaps maybe we're talking about some sort of impediments that held us back from getting done. And the more I think about it, I suspect those last minute things that come across are not necessarily tied to done, but there were some recent impediments that actually stopped us from getting to done. I'd be keen on your feedback, but in any case, thank you very much for the question. Kumar came up with this. I like this one. This is cool. Sorry, I screwed up here. Let me go back. Using the analogy of golf, a short game and a long game. Yes, completely. That's a great analogy. Thank you very much for that. So let's see what we have. It's coming from Swilyanan. In your opinion, how to increase the motivation of the team towards the goal? Ooh. I think there are different ways. It all depends on the team. But I personally am a strong follower of the concept of servant leadership. And for me, servant leadership means that it's my job. And I came up with some examples where Simon Sinek was obviously looking at things in the same direction. It's my job that I can ensure that the people on my team are able to get to done, because that is my job, to get them to done. Now, based on my experience, the reason why a lot of my team members, it could be on the project, it could be line management duties, because they have these impediments. And so I considered myself to be the chief impediment officer, the person the chief impediment exterminator. I was responsible for actually going ahead and getting rid of those impediments. So back to your question, increase the motivation. If you have a boss who actually cares that you have good working conditions, if you have a boss who values your input and is willing to fight for you, if you have a boss who wants you to succeed, and it's one of the most important things for this boss, quote unquote, to make that happen. My personal experience is that's a good way to get people motivated, because that means that you're willing to work for them and you're willing to go in the trenches. And it would be a lie if I said I was always successful. None of us are always successful, but I've always tried. I've always tried to go ahead and do that. And so that would be my personal recipe, getting the trust of the people in your team. And sometimes, and it doesn't work, and then it's time to actually go ahead and part. And I've done that one as well. There's a comment coming from Sean. Bigger is better if it needs to be in order to achieve the desired effectiveness. Well, sure, of course it is, but that means that the focus is not necessarily on the bigger part. but on the effectiveness part, the last part of your sentence. And sometimes to agree with you, or to follow my thoughts through, better said, that to reach scale, which would be my interpretation of what you're saying, to reach scale means you have to make it bigger, or it has to get bigger, because it doesn't have the impact if it stays on a certain size. So I would clearly agree with you there. So let's see what else. What are the questions we have here? It's another question from Sophia. Is there a way to get better fight protectionism? Continuously struggle with that. I'm not really quite sure what you're referring to, but please feel free to go ahead and reach out to me, Sophia, because obviously I want to make sure that that I have a better idea of what the issue is that you're being confronted with, and if there's any way that I can go ahead and help. So maybe if we can make a deal, Sophia, you come back to me, you could write to me directly, or perhaps in the chat box, or feel free to go ahead. And this applies not just to Sophia, this applies to all of you. Please feel free to go ahead and reach out to me, because I really enjoy these sessions, and I like helping people. So here's a question from Seema. What's your view or style to deal with when there are many stakeholders who have the authority to change the scope? Such things create a lot of confusion and difficulties for the project. Seema, truer words were never said. Yes, I agree. And so the real issue is let's go through the scenario. So you have a number of stakeholders, and they all feel that they can go ahead and move things around. I would argue, and this would be the approach I would take, who's the one who's paying for this? Because if somebody's asking for things, and I've been in that situation often enough, that somebody's asking for certain deliverables, but they're not paying for it, then obviously somebody's getting something for free. That maybe it might be applying to that of what you're thinking about here, Seema. But what I try to do is be very clear with the executive sponsor, because I've come to the conclusion that usually the executive sponsor is the person who is going to shine the most if your project goes well. And the executive sponsor is probably hitting his or her cost center. So it's clearly in this person's interest to make sure that things are taken care of in a proper fashion. So in projects, I always try to be very clear in the beginning in the executive sponsors of what my expectations of the executive sponsor is, because I don't want to wait until I get in the middle of this project to be bombarded with all kinds of requests from different stakeholders when I could have come up with better governance in the beginning. And I'd be lying if I said that it always worked, but at least it was the approach that I took. And for the most part, it worked out okay. And I think to have clarity within the roles and responsibility in project is, generally speaking, is a good thing. Chief impediment and exterminator. That's a good phrase to take. Yes. Okay. Let's see. I think this is going to be not sure if this is a question. If workers receive their own performance review as opposed to a team review, wouldn't group just be a better term? Relating sports and business is fun, but it's misleading. Performance review. This is an interesting one, because thank you very much for the statement. If we look at effort from an individual, doesn't matter if we're talking about a project or if we're talking about line management, and the success that's to be achieved with a company, I'm going to make an assumption, especially if we're talking about bonuses, that they're usually tied to some sort of strategic objectives. May be applicable in this case that you're thinking of, maybe not. But as a manager, I always try to make sure that I can clearly identify those things that the individual was actually bringing added value. And I expect it to be a team player as being part of that review. So is it an either or? Probably not. And even staying with the example, if we looked at sports, and of course it all depends on the sport, but very often you have You have individuals that are bringing value, but they don't necessarily get the credit. And we have that within organizations, and we clearly have them within projects.